Hello, welcome to Hash It Out, hosted by Miles to Go. We're a special episode featuring me, Fedor Kossakovski. I'm a web editor and sometimes producer for Miles.
And myself, Brian Truglio, senior editor for Miles O'Brien Productions.
Brian and I dive deeper onto science topics or topics in the news that we think are interesting and that our listeners would want to learn a little bit more about. And there's been something that we've been following a lot recently, and it's been heating up, and that is the whole issue of science transparency and secret science.
No, not secret science.
Brian, secret science is not superhero science or supervillain science.
It's attacking me now. Ow, ow, oh.
It is really an attack on the application of science to policy, or really the usage of science for the greater good.
Yeah.
And recently it started with the House Republican from Texas and chair of the Committee on Science, Space, and Technology, Lamar Smith. Mm-hmm. He introduced something called HONEST Act, which is Honest and Open New EPA Science Treatment Act, last year. And he wants to get rid of secret science, as he says. And in a press release, he said, "The American people have a right to see the data that is used to justify EPA's costly regulations. The HONEST Act requires EPA to base new regulations on sound science that is publicly available and not hidden from the American people." So basically, Lamar Smith there is saying we shouldn't be basing any regulations on science where the data is not released.
Yeah, it sounds very reasonable.
Yeah.
Who doesn't want transparency?
Right.
But what's the real issue with this transparency?
The real issue is that this is just not an issue. It's a cherry-picked thing where you're trying to discredit certain science that you don't like just because you can always find something to pick out in a scientific study, or you can, in specific health studies where they want to keep people's private medical information private and just release the important stuff for the science, that kind of stuff would be thrown out.
In April, the EPA under Scott Pruitt proposed its own transparency rule titled Strengthening Transparency in Regulatory Science. It requires studies that support, quote, pivotal regulatory science, publish their underlying data, models, and assumptions. Studies in ecology might not have a problem here, but medical researchers who conduct studies that involve people and look at the impacts on human health will have a problem. They can't publish their supporting data without violating their patients' privacy. In some cases, it would even reveal people's full medical history. That would violate not only the confidentiality agreements that these patients signed to be a part of the study, but it would also violate federal medical privacy laws. On July 17th, the EPA held an all-day public hearing on the rule, and Fedor and I listened in, not to all of it, but to most of it, on a phone line that the EPA provided. What caught our attention was that every scientist we heard vehemently opposed the rule. There were only a handful of people in favor of it, and none of them were scientists.
Yeah, there were dozens and dozens of people from different organizations, environmental organizations, universities, that kind of stuff, that chastised the EPA for proposing such a rule. Instead of making science more transparent, they say it would stifle important medical research that often goes against deep-pocketed industry interests. And most prominently, people have brought up that the foundational studies for the Clean Air Act and the updates to the Clean Air Act would have been thrown out or would not pass muster anymore, because they do have a lot of confidential medical information there that they have not released, even though those specific studies have been replicated many times over. And the findings have been shown that even if we don't get all of the data released because it's kind of dangerous to release people's data like that, we can still show in other ways that the same stuff is happening in replicable trials.
Yeah.
And I think one of the people that really stood out to us is Professor George Thurston. He's the director of the program in Exposure Assessment and Human Health Effects at the Department of Environmental Medicine at NYU's School of Medicine. And he's a leading scholar on the human health effects of air pollution, you know, like what kind of lung diseases and that kind of stuff happens from particle pollution in the air and asthma links, all that kind of stuff. So he's followed this issue for years. It's not the first time he's seen this happen, and he's been standing up for the science from the beginning. So we thought we would get him on the line and see what he had to say about this. We had a lot of questions for him.
Before we jump into our conversation with George, I just want to provide a little bit of background and clarify a few terms. You're going to hear George mention the 6 Cities study. In 1993, that study found that people in the U.S. who live in more polluted cities die sooner than people who live in less polluted cities. The culprit of the study was fine particulate matter. The 6 Cities study is the basis of many clean air rules, including the Clean Power Plan. That study also appears to be the main target of this transparency rule. You'll also hear us talk about the HEI, which stands for the Health Effects Institute. The HEI is a nonprofit corporation that provides impartial and relevant science on the health effects of air pollution. The important thing is that 50% of their funding comes from the EPA and 50% from the auto industry. The HEI was used to provide independent validation of the Six Cities study.
George, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us.
Thanks again, George, for joining us.
Sure.
When you hear about the rule or read the rule, the language seems very reasonable. Who doesn't want transparent and reproducible science? But what does the rule actually say, and why do scientists seem like they're almost totally united against it?
The rule is rather nebulous, actually. It doesn't give a lot of specifics. But the crux of it is that it says for key studies that they must make their raw data, including about participants in their study, their personal information, their medical information, anything that was used in the study, make that data set available to the public. Anybody could access that and analyze it. The idea being that you could de-identify the people in the study, and this has been done in the past, but there are a number of cases in which people have been able to crack the code. And, as we get more and more big data, at the testimony actually this week, a number of people got up and gave examples where with very limited information they were able to identify a high percentage of people in the United States uniquely. You look at the Golden State Killer, and they just took one big data set, which was a DNA data set, and then they took information about possible suspects and their DNA, put them together, and they were able to figure out who that killer was. Now, in that case, I'm glad he got caught, but on the other hand, it shows that in this age of big data, there's no such thing really as a de-identified data set, especially environmental data sets, because what you're doing is you're taking all this personal information about people, and then you're combining them with environmental data, which is usually publicly available. Anybody could get that, and you'd have pollution levels, as things that would narrow it down so that you could say this is definitely this person based on that they match all of these different environmental factors which you can use to locate them. There's a place with high particles and also high ozone and has low SO2. You could go through and match them up. So I think it would be really too easy in the case of these environmental data sets like EPA looks at.
So it's not protecting anonymity, really.
Right. First of all, there's the loss of anonymity, but then, people will say, well, I don't have anything to hide. But the thing is that when you go to sign people up, then you would have to say to them, well, we'll try and protect your anonymity, but we're going to have to release this data to EPA, and they're not going to sign up. So it has the effect, first of all, where people have promised not to release the data, then they won't. And then they can eliminate that study from consideration. So basically, you're suppressing science, especially in the past. You can't go back and find these people again. Many of them have passed away and things like that. So you can't get permission to release their data. So you'll say, well, we can't do it. And they say, well, okay, we don't have to look at your study. And suddenly you've washed away a lot of the key studies. And then they'll say, gee, there's really no justification for protecting public health because we don't have any studies that are acceptable. And you laugh, but that's exactly what's going to happen. And the other side of it is if they give them the data, then past history has shown, because it's publicly available now, anybody can get it, vested interest will grab the data, hire statistical gunslingers, and then look to undermine the credibility of that science.
Can you point to any time in the past when people have been forced to share data and then, as a result, they received pretty heavy consequences, like weren't able to continue their science or anything like that?
Sure, yeah. The state of Georgia had a similar open records law that they implemented, and the R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company was able to use that to get a hold of the data. And they said that a study that had been done showing that these cartoon characters that the tobacco companies used, remember Joe Camel? Are you old enough to remember Joe Camel?
I remember Joe Camel.
And the study said that this kind of cartoon makes children more aware of cigarettes and tobacco products. And they got a hold of the data and they said, well, it doesn't really show that. And then they basically attacked that researcher and said that he had done illegitimate work. And then he ended up not being supported by his university. And then he walked away and went into private practice and left research. eventually other people did other studies, which is the way we validate things, by the way, is different people do different studies in different places of different populations, and the results were validated. There are a host of cases. Herb Needleman may never have heard of, but he did critical work on lead and its effects on children. He used a technique actually we developed here at NYU in our department, where when children have their baby teeth fall out, you can then take those teeth and analyze them for their lead content. And that gives you a good indicator of the exposure that those kids got to lead. So he took that technique that was developed in our labs, and then he went to communities, I think he started in Philadelphia, and he collected the children's teeth, and then he had the teachers report on problems with behavior, and he did other tests of IQ and so forth, and found, a direct correlation between increasing problems in these children and the lead levels in their teeth. And he published that, I believe, the New England Journal. Anyway, it's published in a medical journal, and then the lead industry didn't like it. They wanted to keep adding lead to gasoline.
And paint, too. Right?
And paint. And he was attacked. They said that he had made mistakes in his research, and the university shut down his immediately. As soon as someone brought up this charge, they said, we'll shut down the research. And he was out of business for a year or two until finally, they went through the whole thing and they said, nothing's perfect. They found like one data point that was off or something, but all the conclusions were confirmed, and that research stood up and was followed by other research which showed that increasing lead levels has damaging effects on kids' IQ and their behavioral and all sorts of neurological effects from lead. But he was an icon in science, and they got him, they slowed him down. I mean, a lot of that's what it's about, is to slow down the progress of science or suppress it entirely. That would be the ultimate goal if they could. And there are other cases that I can't recall off the top of my head where scientists have been gone after. And universities don't always have a good record for standing up for because they get a lot of corporate donations.
Right.
So they don't always stand up for their faculty on these situations.
On the flip side of that, there's constantly the accusations of secret science. Is there any evidence of that? Have there been major studies that were completely faked?
People do things so that they can say, well, we made this great discovery. Cold fusion. Remember cold fusion?
Yeah.
This guy
Oh, yeah.
And they were never able to replicate that because it wasn't real. But that's the way science works. I mean, you get a publication and people kind of scratch their heads and they go, wow, is that true? Well, and then other people are going to do it and try and replicate it or do some variation on it and say, well, if that's true, then this will true. And then they find, well, that's not true. So maybe there's a problem. Rather than taking the same data set and reanalyzing it, which can be played with. But the real validation is to do other studies and have it tested in other places, like we've done with pollution, air pollution, particles. We find in the United States, and we find it in other countries, and we find it in different parts of the United States and in different populations. So that's the kind of replication we need. So that would say we need more funding for research. If they're really worried about this, it would be a lot more productive if they would have EPA support more research in the area and test these results out in more places and confirm or unconfirm results than trying to just go over and over and over and over the same studies. The ones they're talking about are 20 and 30 years old, and there's many newer studies.
Yeah.
I think people have to look at the history of this, and then that makes pretty clear the motives behind it. Otherwise, it's very hard to figure out why they're doing this, because there really is no big problem that this is seeking to, and to the extent that there are problems, there are already mechanisms to deal with them. It's just not needed, and I think that they should be opposed to needless regulations and rules.
This isn't something that's new.
No, I mean, they've been waiting 20 years for this opportunity. There's golden opportunity where they have influence on the House, the Senate, the presidency, and the Supreme Court all at once. They're going to ram everything they can through at this time, and this is one example. The thing that really upset me on Tuesday when I was testifying before the EPA in Washington, a gentleman came on right before me, Stephen Malloy, and he said that the Harvard Six City study and the American Cancer Society study, that was almost 20 years ago or more than 20 years ago. And sure, they were landmark studies at the time, but there's been a lot more studies that show consistent results. And he said that they've never released the data. In fact, they're a textbook case of where they have released the data, and they gave it to a third party, an independent third party, not a vested interest like R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company or a coal company or something. They gave it to an independent body, which was the Health Effects Institute, and they analyzed it, and they said the results were very consistent with what was reported. And so they validated both of those studies. So both of those studies have given up their data and had it scrutinized and been validated. Well, why he would get up and say that they won't release the data, what he's saying is they won't release it to him and people with a vested interest. And that's what they really want. And that goes back 20 years ago when the tobacco companies were worried about the possibility of secondhand smoke regulations. So, I don't know which ways we can tell them this, but they just keep repeating the same talking points, which are not based in reality, to be kind.
You also mentioned this kind of regulation would add a lot of costs to research projects. If this was implemented, what would be the consequences for the average researcher that is looking at air pollution or environmental things or something like that?
Of course, there would be an unfunded mandate to then take the data, de-identify it, try and present it in a way so that the data were there and yet the people could not be identified. So that's not something that scientists, researchers normally do. It's not in their regular business. There's no allowance to provide resources for that. But the implications are many. I mean, we mentioned one before, which was that to do a new study, you have to recruit a cohort. And if people are not willing to sign up because they're worried about their information getting out there for anybody to see, then they're not going to sign up in the first place. So not only would this mechanism disallow and exclude past valid studies with relevant information, it would also deter the generation of new information. So from their point of view, this is a twofer. It gets rid of old science and prevents new science. It doesn't really have any benefits because there's no problem here. We have mechanisms to check the validity of these data using independent people and also revalidation through other people repeating the studies elsewhere. They sell it as something that's going to make for better science. And what its real implications will be is that people will be able to inappropriately undermine people's confidence in science. And I think that's the goal of this requirement, because it's just not required for anything else. I just can't figure out a justification for this new regulation other than for the reasons that the tobacco industry brought out over 20 years ago, Christopher Horner. Christopher Horner was actually on the transition team and perhaps even helped select Pruitt.
And Christopher Horner, what is his background?
He was the one who wrote this R.J. Reynolds memo, December 23rd, 1996. And it came out, you remember when they got all these records from the tobacco companies of all their history of how they tried to dissemble about the health effects of tobacco on people's health? They got all those records and they put them all online, so it's all online. So you can look this up, www.industrydocumentslibrary.ucsf.edu. They have posted all of these records, and one of them is an email from Christopher Horner to the R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company that he was working for, entitled Background and Proposed Program to Address Federal Agency Science. And in it, he lays out basically this proposal, saying we've got to emphasize transparency. When you read that, you say, well, that's Pruitt's proposal. So they've waited 20 years, and this is their window of opportunity to get this requirement. And in their case, they were saying, how are we going to address this threat of regulations on secondhand smoke? So they were concerned about that in the 90s, so they wanted to change the rules, and they were never able to do it. They tried to put it through Congress, and it never passed muster in Congress.
And privately funded work, this transparency rule does not apply to privately funded work, is that correct?
That's right. Yeah, they specifically exclude that. So then they'll be free to do research and no one will be able to check on them.
Going back to how they phrase this about secret science, if anything, that sounds more like secret science.
That's right. I mean, they're a vested interest.
Yeah.
One of the things that really bothers me in Washington is this discussion of special interests, because that puts everybody sort of in the same bin. And I think really we should be looking at people who are in Washington as advocates. There are some for the public interest, and then there's vested interests. If you call them all special interests, then it all sounds like they're the same. But vested interests, they're going to make money on this deal. Whereas people in the public interest, there's really no monetary incentive. They're just out there trying to protect the public good. We really should make that distinction. between lobbyists that are acting in the public interest versus ones that are acting on the vested interest, and make that distinction, which people don't usually do. They say, well, there's this special interest on this side and that special interest on that side, and it sounds like they're both special interests and they should be weighed equally and treated the same. Whereas if you say, well, these people have public interest and these people have vested interest, then you say, ooh, wait a minute, these guys are after the money. Language matters. I think we've learned that over the years.
Mm-hmm. That is an excellent point.
Well, at a minimum, they should be balancing the public's interest and
right.
Business's interest. Okay, I'll get a little off stream here, but did you ever watch the movie Idiocracy?
Yeah, great movie.
I recommend that movie.
Yeah.
It's a comedy, but it's not so funny now, because it's
right.
all about, they basically outsource all the government agencies like agriculture and things like that to private industry, and then what happens? And that's a little too close to home at this point.
I think we've had a movie reference in every episode that we've done, so that's good to sneak another one in there. George, you've mentioned a few times that this isn't the first time that rules like this have been proposed. What sort of lessons have we learned from like the R.J. Reynolds tobacco case, or from other, I know like the late 2000s, early 2010s, in Canada they were muzzling climate research. What sort of things have scientists learned about how rules like this get proposed, maybe go into effect for a bit and then go away or don't get enforced?
Well, I think a lot of scientists aren't even aware a lot of this is going on. Basically, scientists become scientists because they don't want to deal with people, and so they can go and do their research and
they want to hide in a lab somewhere.
Exactly, and not go out to bars and meet people and socialize. Oh my God, socialize. And so, a lot of them don't even know that this is going on. They're busy doing their science. Unfortunately, I think a lot of scientists haven't learned that they have to make sure that their science is properly used. They can't just publish it, put it out there and say, okay, go to town, people in government and people in business, and use the science and learn from it. And they have to actually, wait a second, that you're misinterpreting my science and you're misusing it and twisting it, and they've got to get more involved. And unfortunately, that's just not the way they're trained. That's not their nature. And so there just aren't enough scientists who are really even aware that this is all going on. It's really unfortunate. I think the really big concern from science point of view is that basically underlying a lot of this is an effort to do to science what they've been able to do to journalism. You've got fake news, and then you've got people talking about junk science. Right now they've been able to undermine the press so that they can just hear people say, well, that's just the press. And they would love to be able to get a hold of data and then manipulate it, give it to a cottage industry of statistical gunslingers, and go after science and try and undermine people's confidence in science inappropriately. But that's the sort of more global concern I have. And then within the EPA, it really is that if they wipe away enough science by excluding it and saying, well, you won't release the data to us, so we're going to exclude you, that they'll be able to say, well, there isn't enough evidence to protect public health, so we can relax the standards and allow more pollution. I mean, right now, from air pollution, we have the global burden of disease estimated about 100,000 people die a year in the United States from air pollution. And studies indicate that the average American, well, there's no such thing as an average American, but the typical American loses between a year and 2 years of life because of air pollution.
Wow.
We're so much better off than we were when I was a child, but we still have a ways to go. And we've made this progress, we can't go backwards. And that's what could happen very easily, because right now we have the ozone standard, which is a gas that's very reactive and reacts with your lung and sort of eats away at your lung and irritates your lungs and causes extra asthma attacks. I've done studies of children showing as the ozone levels go up, they have more asthma attacks, and also it increases mortality. And then also particles are another pollutant that's under review. So these are both ozone and particles in the air, which particles are the most, I think, health concern of all the community air pollutants, because it's not only toxic itself, but particles in the air pick up other pollutants and then carry them down deep into your lungs. So normally your body would keep them out, but they take a ride on the particles and get deeper in. So they're not only toxic themselves, but they're enablers. Nothing worse than an enabler, right? So they do double damage. And both of these standards are up for review and will be reviewed before the end of this term of this administration. And in the past, there have been cases where they have relaxed the standards when they found conflicting evidence, and they said, well, we can no longer justify this, so we'll relax the standard. And it has happened once that I can remember for ozone, and there are some other examples. So they're allowed to do that. If the science isn't there to support it anymore. That's why they have a review every 5 years. Get the latest science, find out what's new, and then reevaluate it. But all of a sudden, all the evidence, if it all disappears, then they say, well, this is empty. We got nothing in the box. So we really can't justify the standards we have. So that's the sort of short-term fear, that they'll use this as a way to exclude science and ignore science and suppress science so that they can make the decisions they want to make. But then the larger picture is concerned that they could undermine people's confidence in science inappropriately.
Everything is so hyper-partisan now, attacks and defenses have to be so extreme. But do you feel there's a problem anywhere in the system in terms of verifying science or even peer review? Is there any real problem here, and what do you think the real solution is to that?
Well, I'm not going to say science is perfect, that's for sure. It's constantly changing, and we learn new things. Certainly, science has its flaws. One of the problems we have, and it's going to get worse under this administration and these rules, is that many of the studies we do are dominated by white populations, especially white male and older populations. These are the people who tend to participate in studies, and you can get them to participate. But the most affected people are oftentimes minorities, people of color, people who are of lower socioeconomic status. They're the most affected. They get the biggest exposures. They're most at risk because their health care isn't as good. They may not have insurance, and their diet may not be as good. And yet, they're not going to want to sign up if they're not going to trust scientists with their data. If the government is saying, well, gee, we might want to get our hands on that data and make it available. How are you going to recruit these people? So then you're not going to have them in the populations. And so it's been historically a problem, but I think it's getting worse. So there are limitations on epidemiology, is the one I'm talking about here. And there can be replication problems, but that's why we redo studies and we find it out.
Well, I know in your previous paper you had mentioned, should there be some kind of an independent auditing system, or should the journals take more responsibility for their auditing? Do you see any solutions like that?
Yes, I do think that the HEI is all set up there, and they can do that, and they could use that model. They could actually even use that group, although they tend to specialize in air pollution, but could be expanded. That's where they say, this is working, let's do more of what works, instead of trying to undermine where there isn't a problem. Yeah, the journals need to do more. I alluded to that in the paper I wrote 20 years ago. And I'm saying if the journals don't step up and start dealing with this issue, then it's really going to become a big problem. And they haven't done anything, as far as I can tell, to really
How could they improve, do you think?
I haven't spent a lot of time thinking about that aspect of it,
Sure,
but I think they could take a bigger role in cross-checking results. And like when you have a review, you review what's written. And I review papers all the time, but I don't have access to the data. So one thing they could do is to have the scientific reviewers have access and see the data, or you have a statistician on hand who doesn't have an agenda. I think that's the important thing. And they could have statisticians who would check, say, okay, let us see your data, and then we'll give it back, or we'll work on your data set, something. I think that they could probably address some of the concerns that people raise about these replication problems better. They could start talking to each other and working out systems, but they've ignored it, as far as I can tell.
Meanwhile, the problem has only gotten worse, it sounds like. It just becomes more of a precarious situation where something like what's happening now can happen. Obviously, you don't want this rule to be imposed, but how do you see this playing out in the end? Obviously, there was a huge amount of people testifying against the rule. Did you have any feeling about how it might go?
I'm not optimistic that they'll listen to us. I actually went and spoke to Scott Pruitt a year ago, along with a number of other people. I was representing the American Thoracic Society at that meeting. There was a case where the EPA was proposing to control coal-fired power plants in Texas because of the effects on national parks downwind. That was going to happen under the Obama administration, and they come up with a plan. I think Texas had refused to come up with a plan. So what happens is if a state won't come up with a plan, then the EPA says, okay, well then we'll give you a plan.
Right.
And so then my understanding is they've now said, well, guess what? We don't really need to do that anymore. But what I said to them is, if you don't do this, look, here's a map. I'll show you where people in the state of Oklahoma are going to die because you're not doing anything. I gave them a map of Oklahoma with colored coding of the places in the cities where extra people would die unnecessarily. And he kind of said, yeah, that's irrelevant. And legally, he's right, because it was about the national parks. It wasn't about human effects. It was about effects on visibility and this kind of thing. But morally and politically and just human interest, it's definitely relevant that extra people are going to die. So he didn't really listen. We had a whole group of people, and he didn't listen to anything we said. So I don't find that they're listening to us. I really think it'll come down to this fall's election.
Okay.
If the House turns blue, then a lot of questions are going to be asked about a lot of subjects.
Because there's a similar, it passed the House, but the Honest Act that Lamar Smith, the Republican from Texas, introduced. He's the chair of the Science Committee. It's passed the House, it's stuck in the Senate, right? And so
Right.
how would the House flipping help, just because there'd be more people chairing these committees and asking these questions?
Right. Yeah, they'd be able to start asking questions and bringing in witnesses and documenting these things. And right now, they can't get a hearing, whether it's on the Russians trying to mess with our elections or this kind of suppression of science that they're proposing. Talk to me after the election, and then we'll get a better idea, because that's got to be a really defining moment in a lot of these initiatives that are ongoing. How that election comes out will make a big difference.
Are they on track to set this rule before the elections?
Well, it depends. The Science Advisory Board has asked to review it. And if they review it, they said they would take time to review that. They put in a formal request. And if that's granted, then that's going to take time. And that'll probably push it till after the election.
Okay, I see.
But either way, with a change in who's running the show, then they could start to have hearings on these things and discussing them. And anything that's done can be undone, as we've learned, right?
So the new EPA head, Wheeler, it seems like he's on track to continue Pruitt's legacy. What's your feeling about him concerning this rule and in general?
I don't know that much about him, but as I understand, he was a consultant to the coal industry. So I think that he's very similar in what he'll want to do, but he's been around Washington long enough so he'll know what not to do, to get himself into trouble the way Pruitt did with all his shenanigans. So it's Pruitt 2.0. I think he's going to not have all these complications, and he'll just work under the radar and probably do more damage than Pruitt was doing even. But it remains to be seen. I hope I'm wrong about that.
You said there's no such thing as an average American, but as an average American who cares about this issue, what should we do? It sounds like the midterms are really important, but is there anything else you would recommend about, how we talk about science or how we think about science, or specific actions we could do to really move the needle on this issue?
Yesterday, after I got back, I attended actually another hearing in New York City on a proposal by Governor Cuomo to put a cap on carbon emissions in New York. And I think what's clear is we're not going to see action, take as example climate, at the top, the national level. So it's really got to be at the local level that we do this. And about 100 people showed up for this hearing. And they got up and they spoke very eloquently about what this would mean to them, what Hurricane Sandy did to their lives. They had young people, 10 years old, say that their future is being adversely affected by this. And it was unbelievable. This is what is great about America. Not the stuff that the politicians are talking about. That these people showed up for this hearing, and the government was listening, and the people were speaking, and that kind of involvement gives me some hope. We just need people to do more of that and not lose hope, because their goal is to make people say, forget about it, there's nothing I can do, and then they can do their machinations in peace, and people have to stay involved. Whether it's scientists speaking up about the way their science is used, or the public in the way the policies are affecting their lives, people just have to get more involved. And that's speaking up, going to public meetings, getting involved in elections, working for candidates that they can believe in, and then, of course, voting. which I just saw a poll. I heard a poll on the radio, and they said that millennials are showing no more inclination to vote in this upcoming election than they did for the 2016 election.
You're welcome.
Apparently women are motivated, and their numbers, they show that they're going to vote in bigger numbers. And African Americans, that's where they really found the biggest boost in their interest in getting involved and voting. But I don't get it. You know, millennials have the most at stake.
Yeah.
And they could swing these elections if they would just get involved. But I think they've reached the point where they're saying, oh, it's all bullshit, and we're not going to get involved and sully ourselves. And you can't take that attitude. I'm not focusing just on millennials, but, you know, I'm just using that example.
Yeah.
It's true of all of us. I have a lot of foreign students because I work in science. And one of them is from China, and she was saying how jealous she is that we get to vote. So maybe we should appreciate that more. This election is really important, and people can really make a difference no matter what state they're in.
Thank you very much for your time. Greatly appreciated.
Check back after the election, and we'll see what's happened, whether SAB was able to do anything and whether the election influenced anything.
Yeah,
we shall. Thank you again to Dr. George Thurston. That was a fantastic conversation. We will definitely be checking in with him after the midterms to see if this changed at all.
If the rule gets passed.
Yeah, if the rule gets passed, if we even have science anymore. Thank you for listening to this Hash It Out episode. We hope you rate and review our podcast, as well as we have a little survey up on our website for this. So if you go to milesobrien.com, you shall see all of our reporting. You can see this podcast, and if you have the time, please take our little survey. It'll help us figure out what you like and what you don't like. Anything helps. Also, subscribe to our newsletter. It's free, comes once a week, and it's got all of Miles's favorite science stories and some exclusives if you sign up for the email. So, hope to be in your inboxes.
Until next time.
Bye-bye.